Welcome to Rev Reads. I am thrilled to have you here today as we have another author interview. We're talking to the author of one of my favorite books from last year, Seculosity, and his book that I just read, Low Anthropology. I'm guessing it's going to be up there on my list for this year. We're talking to David Zahl, who is the director of Mockingbird Ministries. He is a pastor at Christ Episcopal Church in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the author of numerous books. David, thank you so much for being on the channel.
Oh, I'm really grateful to be here. Thanks for having me, Shawn.
So we'll just start right off with my biggest complaint for your books, and that is your titles. When I am carrying your book somewhere, people are like, what are you reading? And I'm like, first it's Seculosity. I'm like, Seculosity, and they're always like, is that a real word? And then I show them Low Anthropology, and they're like, I have never heard of such a thing as Low Anthropology. So let's start off talking about what this term means. So what's Low Anthropology, and maybe if you could contrast that with what High Anthropology is to help us get a little bit more foundation of what we're talking about here.
That's funny you say that, Shawn, because these are neologisms slightly. Low Anthropology, those are existing words, but Seculosity certainly was made up for the sake of that book, and it's a risk to do. And now that I feel like I've titled two books this way, I wonder, am I locked into this kind of pattern of these inscrutable names? I'm trying to really write accessible books, and where's the line between a title that's intriguing versus a title that's just baffling and intimidating? So I don't know. I'm trying to get right up to that line. Low Anthropology. So most people are, to the extent that you've heard of the word anthropology at all, you've usually understood it in terms of cultural anthropology, which is the study of how cultures are formed and how human beings relate to one another. So cultural anthropologists would be people that would write their PhD dissertation on the customs of, tribes in the rainforest and the kind of, the courting rituals or something like that, or the economic arrangements. So in that sense, it's kind of sequestered into this realm of social science that people only really hear about at higher education. But anthropology and I don't mean to sound too canned, I've had to explain it a few times, but anthropology, the way that theologians and philosophers use the term, is just meant to kind of connote your operating view of human nature. So it's actually shorthand. It's actually supposed to be a shortening of, like, what do you believe about human beings? What are we good at? What are we not good at? What principles govern our behavior, if anything? So that's your anthropology. And the contention of this book is that everyone has an anthropology, whether they realize it or not. Everyone has something they mean when they use the phrase, I'm only human, or that was a very human thing to do, or I'm just trying to be a human being here. We all have some kind of sense of what that means. And it doesn't mean we have the same sense of it, but we all do have some kind of operating anthropology. And that anthropology, it creates expectations for in our certainly in our relationships, in our jobs, very much in our churches and in our spiritual lives, to say nothing about how we understand ourselves. Like, if you believe men and women are capable of this, then you might expect them to act that way. If you believe they're incapable of that, well, then you wouldn't expect them to act that way. Or if you think something is very easy or something is very hard, there's a range. And so with the low part of this equation, I'm trying to refer to things on the sort of lower end of the range of anthropology. So a high anthropology would be like an optimistic view of human nature, that men and women are good and getting better, and we just need the right information and we can sort of conquer the world. And we are improvable, possibly not perfectible, but improvable. Yeah, pretty close. Like we're capable of a lot more perfect than we currently are. That's a high anthropology. A low anthropology would be what I would call a more sober estimate of human nature, that we are encumbered by all sorts of unseen factors and limitations, and that we are not maybe as free as we'd like to think we are, and that ultimately there's such a thing as a dark side to human nature that is operating out there. And people with small children see it all the time, but it's easy to ignore in our daily lives. So low anthropology doesn't map it, doesn't say human beings are bad versus human beings are good. It's much more saying, like, what is more definitive of us? Is it this our greatest accomplishments, or is it our liabilities, or is it some mixture of the two, our strengths or our weaknesses? And low anthropology basically says that if you really want to get to know someone, you need to know about what they leave off their resume rather than what they put on.
Yeah, no, which I thought was a great way to, talk about how we should view each other. And that is being good with the low stuff. And that is the places where we'll kind of suffer together, struggle together. And sort of the view that a high anthropology is, if I give somebody the right tools, I should expect the right results out of them. Sort
Mm.
of that type of if I educate somebody, I can expect them to be productive, wonderful, healthy citizens. So how does a high anthropology then end up being oppressive upon other people in life or bring bitterness into your own heart?
Yeah, well, I would say that it doesn't function uniformly, or one person's high anthropology and another person's low anthropology. I want to, like, there's a slight, it can be a little fluid, and I'll explain what I mean by that later. But generally speaking, um, if we take a step back and look at our culture, and we think that we are a culture that suffers from what today is called burnout, but you might as well just call exhaustion or fatigue, um, and the sense that life is demanding more of you than you can ever possibly produce or deliver. It's the cry of the young mother who says, "I can't be in two places at once." It's the complaint of the millennial who says, I can't work three jobs in order to pay back my loans, and I'm not. We're all tent makers all of a sudden, that in a sort of New Testament parlance. It's the cry of the healthcare worker who's saying, like, I can't handle this much emotional strife or whatever it is. So there is one sense in which a high anthropology, or a view of us that does not take into consideration our limitations and the fact that we need 8 hours of sleep a day, and that we can only do so much, and that our bodies need food and stuff like that. Um, well, if you're constantly working with an inflated view of that, with high anthropology, it's going to create exhaustion, or the sense that you're the only one who's, like, struggling to keep up. That's a refrain you hear, especially among, like, students in high schools and colleges, is that everyone else is on top of things and they're the only one. They're paddling underwater, duck syndrome. They're
Yeah.
like this, and up. It's kind of smooth above the water, and underneath they're like this, and they think they've internalized some standard that's unrealistic, and so they think that they're the only ones. When, of course, if you get to know them, if they come to your church or something, like, you find out everyone feels that way.
Yeah.
So high anthropology is oppressive and embittering in that sense. It creates loneliness, it creates burnout, and it also just creates judgment. I think if you were expecting people to be better than they're capable of being, you're going to start to hate them over time. And that applies to people in churches, and it applies to people as politicians and school boards, etc. Um, I've told you what to do. Why won't you do it? I mean, it applies to people in marriage. I've told him he needs to chew with his mouth closed, and yet he continues to do it. And all of a sudden, I feel resentment building up. And the truth is that we tend not to respond well to, or information criticism alone is never enough
Yeah.
to move the needle, shall we say. So those are some ways in which it's embittering and isolating and confusing and insulting.
Yeah, no, what I thought most from what I was getting from your book is the idea that if you have a high anthropology and you assume that if I give you the information, you're going to change off of it, and then
Mm,
they don't change, then you must think that that person is purposefully or intentionally ignoring you, or they're
mm,
purposefully trying to undermine you. When in reality, like, if I continue to chew with my mouth open, even though my wife's told me not to, I'm not purposefully doing that to ignore her or to annoy her. I'm just doing that because that's my habit of what I've always done. And I can't stop chewing with my mouth open no matter how much I try to do it. And so it has nothing to do with how I feel about my wife, but I feel like a high anthropology, like that's what I was getting from your book, is that when people don't improve, we can end up taking that as an insult about ourselves,
Mm.
that they're purposefully trying to ruin our lives. And I think that that just turns us into very embittered people toward others in our lives.
Yeah, everyone's you're just a disappointment to yourself and other
Yeah.
people if you assume a very high capacity for change and kind of ability to metabolize information and put it to use, actionable items, whatever term people want to use, sermon applications. It's a recipe for resentment, because it expects people to operate in ways that you're incapable of operating. And I think it's a category mistake, and it's unfortunately, but it's rampant in the culture, because the high anthropology tends to flatter us because it tells us we
We can
are
do it.
wonderful and we
Yeah.
can do it and we're in control of ourselves.
Yeah.
And the truth, the testimony of the human history is that we're in control of some things, but the most important stuff, um,
Not so much.
not so much. So I think the book is trying to say what sounds great on the surface can become a very oppressive and embittering thing. What sounds slightly insulting for a view of human nature, of actually, no, you are limited. Everyone is fighting a battle, and there are certain ineluctable headwinds into the human life, that actually yields fruit, like compassion and patience and tolerance and love and all these things that we claim to value as Christians.
Yeah. One thing you sort of hit head on in this book in a section is on how we are egocentric.
Mm.
We are self-centered, and that stops us from being able to be sympathetic and to cooperate with other people. And I think it's a really hard for people to get out of that egocentric mindset. We're kind of inbred with that, to think of ourselves first. So how does a low anthropology take on ourselves and others help us combat that egocentric without turning us into a sort of woe is me, there's no point of doing anything for myself, I might as well
Mm.
just, forget myself entirely.
Well, one thing about a low anthropology, and this is another, what's symptomatic of a high anthropology is that everyone is certain about everything. We think all of our positions and our opinions we're so sure of ourselves today. And I think that the internet kind of makes that more possible in a way that is, corrosive. But a low anthropology says, no, you can't. You are incapable. You're not God. You are incapable of of having all the facts, the full understanding of just about anything. And so, in a sense, like, you're incomplete, and you're a person who's in need of help, and a person who's in need of deliverance, ultimately. But the way that relates to sort of a kind of a woe is me cynicism, because I think people can take this view of human nature as being like a cynical view. It's not cynical. Cynicism is a kind of a different type of certainty about human behavior and motivation. It's saying, like, I know for certain that there is no hope in the situation, that there's no use in trying. A low anthropology says, no, you don't. You don't know that. And in fact, what life testifies is that we're frequently surprised, and we're not just surprised by ugly things. We're more surprised, I think, by beautiful things.
Yeah.
And in at least as a creature in God's world, I find that is the great excitement of life. And so, a low anthropology does not expect these, to be astounded, but because it doesn't expect that, it is astounded, rather than just resenting the world for not being more beautiful or more good all the time, or other people for not being like less like you or sinless or something like that. Because I really think, Shawn, if you have an understanding, a high anthropology which says, I just need to tell people what to do and they'll do it. If they stop doing it, yes, they're either out to get you, or they're insane. And anytime you hear people characterize some other group of people as evil or insane, you know they're dealing with a high anthropology. They've separated themselves from these other people. But the other thing is, like, as the person trying to convey the information, what do? You just shout it louder. That's what you think. The problem is that I'm just not yelling at they can't hear me, so I'll, like a person with a hearing aid, I just have to sort of yell louder and louder and louder, which of course has the exact opposite effect on the person being yelled at. So yeah, I don't know how I got to that question, but it's a dance that is fairly counterintuitive, but I feel like we're on solid ground, just experientially as well as biblically, when we talk about a low anthropology.
So you talk about doubleness in this book, and that was a term that I was unfamiliar with. And so can you talk a little bit about what doubleness is, and then how it relates to the way that we view others? Because I found that was a really helpful chapter in the book.
Sure. Well, I break low anthropology down into 3 pillars. The first one is limitation, and there's no really a moral dimension to that. That's just the fact that we can only do so much. Yeah. And we cannot know it all. We cannot do it all. We cannot care about it all. And basically, that's just how we're created, or wired, as they say today. The second thing is doubleness, though, and that's a word you haven't heard about it because I made it up.
Oh, you made it up? Oh man, I did not get that from the book. I was like, he's using this other term that I've just never heard of before. Okay.
Well, I wanted to say conflictedness, but that doesn't roll off the tongue quite the same. But doubleness is the sense that there are competing motivations within a person. That I'm drawing on low anthropology in my mind is a Christian anthropology. So I'm drawing on the insights of the Bible and our grand tradition, and we would talk about there's the flesh and the spirit, there's the conscience, and there's the sort of heart and the head and the mind and the spirit, and there's kind of like a competing group of motivations inside a person. And so the great description in the Bible of doubleness is of Romans 7, of the good that I know I should do, I don't do, and the evil that I know I don't want to do, that I keep on doing. And that is one of the great Pauline insights, but it's just it translates directly into a sense of which we are often at odds with ourselves. And when we talk about what's in so-and-so's best interest, that's a very complicated question. If you've seen the movie Inside Out, and there's like a panel of emotions that are competing for airtime in terms of it's a Pixar movie where they're competing for airtime within a young girl's head, and sort of kind of sadness wants her to do this, and anger wants her to do this, and they're fighting over the control board. Like, that's much more what it's like to be a human. And so to understand, if you want to understand why people do the things they do, it helps to have some sense that they are at the mercy of sometimes very overpowering internal factors, shall we say. And not all of them are benign, and some are better than others, but no one is completely the master of their own ship. Or if they are the master of their own ship in some ways, then in other ways they're not. And the great matter of addiction is the kind of principal language to understand doubleness. But we're doubled in the sense that we want 2 things at once, and we're not simply rational creatures making reasonable decisions. That in fact the heart reigns over the head in a very visceral way. And so it's a Saint Augustine, as I draw on him. Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine's a town. Saint Augustine, I draw on him in that chapter where he very much understood we are what we love, that people are driven by desire. So if you want to know someone, you have to figure out what they love, not what they think. You have to look to see where their heart lies. And Jesus says the same thing. Like, where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. I mean, it's all taken from Christ.
Yeah, and then at the same time, it's so helpful to remember the fact that people want different things. They have different competing desires and best interests even in themselves, because I think sometimes what we do mistakenly is that if someone acts in a certain way in this one moment, we use that moment to paint our view of them.
Hmm.
And it's a very uncharitable thing to do. And we don't think about how people aren't simply the basis of one action, one behavior. They got a lot going on that's going to be dictating what they do in those situations. And it allows us to be a lot more charitable. So
Charitable and imaginative. I mean, I think imagination is a great
yeah.
category here, because if you don't understand why someone is doing something that you don't like, it's oftentimes a failure of your imagination.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah. No, it's true. Yeah. I can't
what would it
imagine a
take for
good
you
reason
to do
somebody would do
something?
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
can you imagine what it would take for you to do? And sometimes good stories can put us in those headspaces. We're like, oh my gosh, all right, now I realize why someone would do that to themselves, or someone would vote in that way, or someone would decide to make a fool of themselves in this kind of way. I think that's imagination is another key faculty of a low anthropologist, and it's usually opposed to kind of empirical certainty about things.
Yeah, no, I've actually, preached on this recently in my church about, and the illustration I use is when people run late for something. Like out of
Oh.
all the silly, like not harmful things in the world, is to show up late for something. Like in
Mm.
the grand scheme of things, that's so minor. And if we show up late, though, we know exactly why we showed up late, and so we're charitable to ourselves. But if somebody else shows up late, we don't have enough imagination to think what would have made them run a few minutes late. And I
Mm.
think this doubleness allows us, when we can think that way and view people from that perspective, it allows us to think, well, they probably weren't purposefully trying to sabotage, my plans for today by showing up 5 minutes late. They probably had something else going on, and so I can be all right with that.
That's so funny. I mean, that's true. I have a friend here who someone asked him how he was doing, and he said, I'm just doing my best to take everything that happens in my life personally. So if someone's late, oh, it's because they don't care about me. Like, that's
Yeah.
the reason they're late, and that's as we know, that's seldom the reason we're late. I mean, sometimes it is, but there is I'm sorry I'm late. I didn't want to be here. Remember that T-shirt. But for the most part, when you get down to it, yeah, you find out that all the other things were going on, and they weren't actually thinking of you. So,
Yeah, no. So I found that to be a helpful chapter for a lot of reasons, and already people in my church didn't know it at the time, but it was influencing behind the scenes in an illustration that I gave. So,
oh, thank you.
so one another thing I liked about the book is I feel like this book can really help people develop friendships if they can think from this perspective. And one thing we live in this world is sort of a friendship vacuum. Like, just most adults don't have friends
Mm.
statistically, especially adult men. And so, how does low anthropology, from your perspective, help people to create friendships? And then, if you got some, to turn them deeper than that surface level of, I'll talk to you about the weather and this weekend sports game.
Yeah, I love this aspect of low anthropology, and I think it's of very urgent import, as you mentioned. I don't think the lack of friendships among, especially grown men in America, is not, again, it's not a neutral thing.
Yeah.
It wreaks absolute havoc and destruction, because it means that men are alone and despairing, and there's no intimacy. It's a total breakdown, in fact. So I don't think it's like some kind of just quirk of our society. A Low anthropology acknowledges that friendships and intimacy, love is it travels on the rails of a low anthropology. That's what I've been saying. What I mean to say is that if you go to a wedding, any wedding, basically under the sun, and where they have groomsmen toasts and bridesmaids toasts, and you go to the rehearsal dinner where that happens. I mean, not everyone tradition does that, but I go to a lot of these because I work in it with college students, where I used to, and so I'm involved in a lot of weddings. And you listen to the toasts, and the women, for example, they say, yes, the bride is beautiful and she's talented. We all know that. but let me tell you what she's really like. Let me tell you about this thing that happened our junior year of college. Let me tell you about in high school when we got pulled over by the police, or let me tell you about what she's like in her sweatpants on a Tuesday night. It's not the moments of pride that forge that relationship. It's the moments of either mundanity or, in fact, adversity, the weakness, and people feel known. They feel respected and admired for their accomplishments, but they feel known and especially loved when you see what they're less proud of, and you're there. This is why, because the guys get up there and they just sort of roast the groom, and they basically say, he can't believe anyone's marrying him. I love this guy. He's the most loyal person ever, but I only know that because of what happened that one Tuesday in 1994, when we really had one too many or something like that. It's always, this is why people make some of their best friends usually in high school and in college, because you're kind of suffering together, or at least you're around each other enough to see the bad, the good as well as the bad. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot of buzzwords today about vulnerability, but some of them are really good, because relationships that don't involve vulnerability don't involve any kind of love or intimacy. And so that's what a low anthropology says. If I want to get to know you, if I want to feel close to you, I need to know not what you're most proud of. I need to know what you're least proud of, or I need to see you in your unguarded moments with your makeup off. I need to see you, let's go on a hunting trip, or let's go on a guy's weekend where we somehow can get past the glad handing and the sort of ribbing, and get to experience something together where we are sort of brought together, not at a point of strength, but of weakness. I use my example, like I'm part of an exercise group that just men, and we work out in the morning, and the real gift there is the friendships, because you're sort of, people are of various fitness levels, and some guys are really in great shape and some guys are not in good shape, and sort of our giftedness separates us from one another. But at the end of the workout, when we're all sweaty and exhausted, we're all high-fiving and talking about what's gone on, and we feel close and we feel like we've survived something together, and that's where the relationships are formed, and all of a sudden we're talking about the most serious things in our lives too. So that's
What's
probably
your workout group called?
F3.
I'm also an F3. What's your nickname?
I'm
What's your
Soapbox.
nickname?
I'm Soapbox.
Soapbox.
I think it's one of the reasons why I love that group. I mean,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think that's what's really going on in that group. There's a lot of things that are going on, but that's one of them.
No, as you were talking earlier in your thing, I was like, oh man, be good to talk about F3 right now, and about F3 enables a low anthropology. So,
it does, under the guise of like, we're all going to get better and we're going to be great and we're going to be men. But in practice, they're giving you a name that's slightly embarrassing. That's important, because it can't be like the best guy ever, speedster. It's got to be something like Soapbox, because I'm a preacher. I get called Soapbox, and
I'm Rev Sox because I'm a pastor who was a Yankees fan.
Rev Sox? I mean, that's good though.
Rev Sox, so yeah.
I love it. Rev Sox.
Yeah, no. Yeah, no, and F3 is fantastic, and it breaks you down. I think one thing about the workouts that are great, and why it testifies to what you say, you will look like an idiot at some point during your F3 journey. There will be a point where you will be the slowest guy, or the one who does everything wrong, and everyone will mock you and make fun of you, and it will bond you with that group of men like nothing else in the world.
Yeah, it's so true. I found in practice, it's one of the things that I feel like that is it tests, while also doesn't ignore people's giftedness and encouragement and all the encouragement that comes out of it. Though people feel accepted, and men do, at least. I don't know how it works in other situations, but certainly it's how it's worked for me.
So if you're in F3, Low Anthropology by Soapbox.
Come on, guys.
Recommended by Rev Sox.
They're actually my local F3 chapter is reading this book. which
Well,
cracks me
now that
up
we're
because
having this conversation, I was thinking I am going to start a read through of low anthropology in F3 New Orleans, and we're going to start it
I
down here.
thank
So.
F3 Seville in the acknowledgments.
Okay, so there we go. No, I'm with a brother here. I didn't even know I had. So F3's touching everywhere. So
Praise God.
all right.
Yep.
So let's take off our F3 shirts and put on our clergy church perspective and talk about how low anthropology relates to the church, because this was probably, as a pastor, this is my favorite section of the book. So how does low anthropology relate to the way that we treat our community in the church as opposed to a church that might have high anthropology?
Yeah, I mean, while I say I think a low anthropology is a Christian anthropology, that doesn't mean that plenty of churches don't espouse a very high anthropology. And what I mean by that is usually the idea is once you become a Christian, you develop certain kind of through the Holy Spirit, and it's very rarely kind of conscious, but implicitly there's this idea that you become capable of things you weren't capable of before in and of yourself. And so you get this sort of situation where people who've been in a certain type of high pressured Christianity, where it becomes about performance or performing your devotion or performing your piety or your faith, they sometimes get to a point where they give up and they say, I just can't do it anymore. Like I'm just this is too exhausting. It's like everything's spiritual homework. It's a new treadmill that I'm on instead of the place I go when I fall off the treadmill. I mean, I think that's my vision of the church is a transformative community that is based around our common need for God and God's love for us, and meeting us in that need. So it's not based around in any way, at least the liturgy that we say in my church. I mean, from the very beginning, it's always there's a confession of sin. There's a sort of an acknowledgement that God can see all, knows all, and but is also not turning his face away. So, but that we approach God not from the perspective of God owes me something, but that with outstretched hands, please, Lord, help me. So I think a church, usually high anthropology sneaks in through sort of how we view people post-conversion and how much of a role we allow the Holy Spirit to play, or if we just sort of view people as kind of able to, is Christianity become like a sin management program or a behavior management program? And I think that's a fairly modern innovation of American Christianity. I think traditionally the church has been a place, it's been word and sacraments where the word of God is preached. It's where your clergyman is the person who proclaims God's forgiveness. And, it's the community that flows out of that common need, that common confession. So we come together as Christians, not because God has done such great things for us, although he may have. We come together because we, like you, I need God, and I know that I also need help. I think one of the people ask me, what is a low anthropology? One of my go-to explanations is it's a view of human nature that sees people as fundamentally in need of help. Help from others, neighbors, and ultimately from God. And I would say not just help from God, but deliverance, salvation, redemption from God. But we in the church have a view of there's a one body with different parts, and that which the hand and the arm and the foot and the knee and the head. I'm going to have different blind spots from you, and I need you. I need you for the sake of the sort of iron sharpens iron, but also my neighbor needs me to be a person who is of service and can also preach the gospel to them. There's all sorts of ways in which I believe, like it sometimes comes down to, do you believe that the church is a sort of a boot camp for saints or a hospital for sinners? And I err on the hospital for sinners part of that, provided that there is a healthy role for the Holy Spirit to play, acknowledging that God works in the world through broken people to do amazing things. And we see that all the time. So That's a little bit how I see it in the church.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a great chapter. I think one of the issues that I ended up seeing when I was reading it is that I think a lot of things of what we've done, and as you said, I think this is an American church by and large issue that we've sort of turned from the more of like a self-help model. We're here to turn ourselves into people who can accomplish what we want to in life. But I think one of the problems is where we turn Christianity into a bait and switch, where it's a place for people to come when they need forgiveness and
Mhm.
grace and mercy, and then you get that initial forgiveness, grace and mercy, and then all of a sudden it's gone because now I expect you to live in such a way where you no longer need forgiveness and you no
Mm.
longer need grace and you no longer need mercy. You've matured to the point where you're just giving that to others instead of receiving yourself. And I felt like low anthropology allows people to say, I will always need the grace and mercy and forgiveness because I'm not going to arrive in this life. And I just appreciated that perspective. And I hope that as a pastor, one thing that I'll be able to communicate to my church is that when you do have those broken moments, and even if it's not a moment, but it's like a broken like decade, we'll still be merciful and gracious because we understand that you're not Jesus.
Yeah, you'll never become a person who doesn't need Jesus. Like that's just not part of
Yeah.
the. That's not what it looks like to become a better Christian. I mean, and I hate that phrase. I mean, I think it's the journey of Christian sanctification is the journey into deeper dependence on God.
Yeah.
A sort of a he must increase, I must decrease. It's not a sort of I get to a point where I need God less, or I climb some ladder. It's a descent, like everything in the Christian life. It's sort of a descent into the grave where God brings new life to things that are dead. And I think it's profoundly hopeful for churches that are pastors that are banging their head against the walls. Why won't my people come more? Why won't they give more? Why won't they, serve more? Why won't they read their Bibles more? I mean, that is what the forgiven heart wants to do those things, I, rather than expect people to be somehow less
Yeah.
who they are. And
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that's not a way of blessing terrible behavior or something like that. I find terrible behavior increases when people don't feel like they can confess it and they drive
Oh,
it
yeah.
underground and they
Yeah.
split and they feel like I'm the only one here who's still struggling with this ongoing temptation or urge or something like that. And then it becomes secret and weird and destructive in a different type of way. Whereas a church that has a low anthropology knows that you never graduate from your need to hear God's
Hmm.
grace.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. And it's so true. Yeah. And I think it's an issue overall in American churches and one
The
that,
pastors don't ever get past that either, by the way. I think they need to be in touch with the gospel as well.
oh, very much so. Very much so. I am, if I had any thoughts that once becoming a pastor, I would end up maturing beyond all of this. I've learned that that is not the case. I still have much need of forgiveness and mercy as well in my life. So,
Mm.
and I also like to talk about in the keeping in the church realm. So, how does low anthropology relate to the gospel itself? And then being in relationship with Jesus Christ. So we sort of more just talked about community, and let's get more between us and God and us and Christ and the gospel.
Yes, well, I think low anthropology sees people as fundamentally in need of God, um, and that we're not mini gods. That there is a God, and you're not He. And that's okay, actually. If you really want to get into it, a low anthropology, the three pillars are a way for me to translate a biblical anthropology, which would be creatureliness, which is limitation. Secondly, would be the bondage of the will, which is the doubleness, and or just teachings about human agency, which are as being compromised, which is a very much a biblical idea. And thirdly, self-centeredness would equate to sin, and that there is some sort of gravitational pull, through our inheritance of Adam's inheritance sin, that we not only want things, we want the wrong things and too much,
Mhm.
and we have an incredible tendency to adopt inverted priorities, shall we say? Um, or we love the wrong things too much and the right things too little. It's how it relates to the gospel is that God is. I always say a low anthropology has a way of it goes hand in glove with a high Christology and a high pneumatology. But a high Christology, what I mean is that the smaller you view yourself, the larger you view God. If you read like
yeah,
the Hebrews, there's a nosebleed high view of Jesus Christ as being like the great high priest and sort of before the foundation of the world, and all of this incredible stuff. And you want to say that like that is of great comfort to someone who has become well aware of their own self-defeating tendencies and their own smallness. And that's not the same as hating oneself. It leads into a deeper appreciation and gratitude for God. So I think, this. Do you view people as just in need of a little coaching from God, or God helps those who help themselves, which is not in the Bible? That's Benjamin Franklin. Or do you view people as sinners in need of redemption and
Amen.
resurrection? And that's so. I think any gospel that does not begin, or at least include a low anthropology quickly becomes not very good news at all.
Well, because it turns into good work or good self-discipline or good efforts, and it's not news of what
And
Christ
Jesus,
does for
we
sinners.
shrink Jesus down into
Yeah,
someone we can manage. God becomes completely subject to our own efforts, and we like that because it appeals to our sense of control. But I don't think it ultimately has much to do with the God of the Bible, like who
yeah,
saves those who cannot save themselves, and who justifies the ungodly. And while we were yet sinners, the God who was crucified and then raised. So that's a much grander, metaphysical, exciting, radical view that human beings are in such need of redemption that God needs to come and die and be executed. I mean, that's a pretty
yeah.
you sort of like, if that's the solution, what's the problem? Well, let's talk about low anthropology.
Yeah, it's obviously not high anthropology if Jesus is dying for us. Yeah. No,
Yes.
it's no, it's wonderful. No, I love how that works in there of our need for Christ, our need for him to bring life to us because we can't work our way up to that life. So
Hmm.
no, it's all great. No, I loved what you put there about that section on our relation to God in the book. And so, just last couple of points in our interview. Thanks for the time so far. It's been great. What was your initial inspiration for low anthropology? What made you start writing this book?
Well, a couple things. I was going around the country talking about seculosity, and the sense that people feel under extreme demand from, yes, people in religious context do, from like sort of being a perfect Christian. But I was just get the sense that everywhere I went, what people resonated with about that book was the pressure cooker environment that they felt that they were in, the treadmill that we were on. And I that book is an attempt to talk about the problem in terms of justification. Actually, that book's about justification, what Protestants understand by justification by faith versus justification through works. I phrase that in terms of enoughness. But when in talking about low anthropology, I felt resonance, and I always want to do something that's pastorally incisive and helpful to people who are actually either in ministry or in the pews or whatnot. I wanted to. So there's a couple different things. I also felt like I needed a book that I could give to basically anyone, to make sense of why someone would want to be a Christian in the first place. And it started further back. It started with experience, and it was geared not towards people necessarily who even would read the Bible. I wanted them to sort of, I wanted to back into it, I guess you could say, in a way that I found personally, I couldn't find a book like that was speaking in our direct context. So for better or worse, hubristically, arrogantly, I just tried to write one. The other factor is, as I said, I'm very attuned to anxiety and mounting pressures. And when I saw all of these articles about burnout and perfectionism, and loneliness, those main emotional conditions, I thought to myself, we are really suffering under a weight of a high anthropology, and this might be a way to share the gospel with people by kind of getting to that. So those are a few inspirations. I feel like I'm forgetting one key one, but yeah, I thought that we could, that we were, people were suffering and dying under the weight of this people they were failing to become, these fantasy people that we all thought we'd had to become. And so I thought that I want to say, what can I marshal from the bag of tricks that the Christian faith has given me? How can I bring this to bear in a way that might make sense of life, in a way that can serve the church and speak to my own, the pain and frustration and exhaustion of being a person in 2022.
Yeah. No, and it was helpful. And no, I didn't even consider that. No, good use for this book is if you know somebody who isn't part of the church, they have no interest really in the scriptures, but they are complaining about being burnt out by life. This book could be a good one to hand off to them. It's well written, easy to read, and I flew through it. I thought you did a great job making it very relatable in your writing style. So I appreciated that.
Oh, thank you, Shawn.
And then finally, when it comes to Mockingbird Ministries, can you tell me a little bit about what that ministry is and what people can gain from Mockingbird?
Sure. Mockingbird, it's the idea that you always need to, we're repeating the message we've heard, which is the message of the gospel, which is the sort of, forgiveness of sins and the absolution of the sinner on behalf of Christ's shed blood. That's the historical language. And so we're a platform at this point. By that, I mean, we have a website and podcasts, and we have a print magazine, and we have lots of conferences and stuff like that. Excuse me. And we exist to sort of connect the grace of God with everyday life in sort of interesting and creative ways. We've been doing that for a long time. And the core conviction is that no one ever expires from their need to hear that God loves them, and that there's hope even for them. So that's what Mockingbird is about. We've been around for 15 years now, and so I do a podcast called the Mockingcast, and I write books like this. But there's a very active website, mbird.com, and we've had a lot of fun doing it. I think we occupy a increasingly strange place in the American or Western culture, Christian landscape, where we're not very partisan, and there's some people who are coming from the main line, and some people are coming from evangelicalism, and some people coming from even like Roman Catholicism or Pentecostalism, but see that Christianity has something very good to offer the world in the form of the grace of God. That's where we're at.
And if there is one message that we need repeated more of, it's God's grace. I mean, when God described himself to Moses in Exodus 34, he highlighted his compassion and his grace and his mercy, giving that loving kindness for 10,000 generations and only punishing for 3 and 4. So God's clearly emphasizing that grace, which glad that you're doing there. So again, it's M as in mocking, mbird.com is where you can find all the information that's on there. And again, the book that we talked about is Low Anthropology by David Zahl. I also reviewed his book Seculosity, which is excellent. One of my readers put me on to you, David, and I'm so glad that he did. And so I highly recommend his book. And if you're new to Rev Reads and you haven't watched anything on the channel before, I'd encourage you to subscribe and be a part of what we're doing at Rev Reads. I'm putting out 1 to 2 book reviews each week. Want to introduce you to more wonderful Christian book and Christian literature that is out there. And if you want to support what we're doing, you could go to buymeacoffee.com/Rev Reads. I'm giving away books regularly on there to people who are members of the channel and supporting what we're doing. But again, thank you so much, David Zahl, for spending this time. Although from now on, I think I'm just going to call you Soapbox. So,
You're welcome to Rev Socks.
If you sweated in F3, you have earned the right to call somebody by their F3 nickname. So no, thank you so much, and I'm overly thrilled that you're a part of the community, and hopefully we can introduce a few more guys to F3 as a result of that, and also get a few more people reading Low Anthropology by David Zahl. So again, thank you so much, David. Thank you for those who have watched, and I hope you have a blessed day.